All right, welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources here sent in by you, exploring something that feels, well, almost sci-fi, but it's getting very real, very fast.
Yeah, definitely. We're talking about new ways to potentially create life, create families, specifically things called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG,
Right.
and these stem cell-based embryo models, SCBEMs.
And these aren't just like small tweaks to IVF, are they? Your sources suggest they could fundamentally change how we think about reproduction.
That's the potential, absolutely. Reshape our whole understanding of parenthood, even.
Exactly. And our mission here in this deep dive isn't just to unpack the science, which is complex enough, but really to understand through the lens of your sources how one particular place, Singapore, is grappling with the huge ethical, legal, social questions these technologies throw up.
Singapore is such an interesting case, isn't it? You've got this super modern, tech-savvy city-state, but it's also dealing with some very specific, quite intense societal pressures.
And the stakes there seem incredibly high. I mean, these technologies could offer solutions to real problems Singapore's facing, demographic problems.
Right.
But they also bump right up against some deeply held values and existing laws. It's a real balancing act.
It's a complex negotiation they're facing.
So yeah, this deep dive, it's not just about what happens in a lab. It's about identity, family, and what a society decides really matters when technology starts to outrun tradition. Okay, so let's set that Singapore scene first, based on what's in your sources. It's described as, small, wealthy, an island nation, very reliant on its people, its human capital.
Yeah, lacking natural resources means that skilled workforce is everything.
And that leads directly to this problem that's highlighted again and again, a major demographic crunch. The sources actually call it an existential threat.
Strong words. And it's driven by this incredibly low fertility rate.
The numbers are pretty stark, aren't they? Your sources mention 1.04 children per woman in 2022, and then it dropped even further.
Yeah, down to 0.97 in 2023. I mean, that's way below replacement level.
And at the same time, the population is aging rapidly.
So the government's response, as your sources outline, is already heavily invested in trying to turn this around, leaning on assisted reproductive technologies, RT.
Like IVF, they mention substantial financial subsidies for IVF in public hospitals already.
Exactly, which sets the stage for IVG and SCBEMs. Your sources frame them as these potential game changers, especially for those really difficult infertility cases where current art, like IVF, just doesn't work.
And Singapore has poured money into biotech, hasn't it? But it also has this reputation for being quite careful, quite rigorous with regulations.
Right. Maybe even conservative in some areas, which makes it really insightful to see how they're likely to approach these specific, very cutting-edge technologies, which is what your sources are trying to predict.
And it's important to stress the sources aren't arguing what Singapore should do. They frame it as a descriptive and evidence-based predictive analysis.
Yeah, it's about looking at the current laws, the policies, the values, and saying, okay, based on all this, how will Singapore likely respond, or how might they respond?
With a big emphasis on what the sources keep calling sociocultural values.
That seems key. So the central question driving this whole analysis really is, how do these brand new technologies line up against Singapore's existing rules, family law, health regulations, and these dominant cultural norms?
Okay, so let's get into the tech itself. We need a handle on what IVG and SCBEMs actually are. Let's start with IVG in Vitro Gametogenesis.
Okay, so IVG fundamentally is about making sperm cells and egg cells the gametes, but doing it in the lab.
How?
You start with ordinary body cells, like, say, skin cells. You take those and you reprogram them, essentially winding them back to become pluripotent stem cells.
Like a cellular reset button, turning them back into really versatile cells.
Kind of, yeah, a blank slate state. Then, from that pluripotent state, you use specific chemical signals and conditions to coax them, to differentiate them into becoming functional gametes, either sperm or eggs.
Okay, but your sources flag a significant technical challenge here. Getting meiosis right.
That's the big one. Meiosis is the natural process where cells divide to have their chromosome number. It's essential for reproduction, and it also shuffles the genes around to create diversity.
So mimicking that process accurately in a dish is tough.
Extremely tough, but crucial for safety and viability. The sources do mention successes in animals, those studies from Japan, China, where they've produced live, fertile mice and rats using IVG gametes.
So it's working in mice, and the prediction is it's likely applicable to humans in the near future. What about the risks? What safety worries do the sources bring up?
Well, the main ones are things like aberrant epigenetic modifications, basically. Unintended changes in how genes work, even if the DNA code itself isn't changed. Plus risks of chromosomal abnormalities or just errors in the genetic code creeping in during the lab process. These are still pretty big unknowns for human application.
Got it. So IVG is about making the ingredients sperm and eggs. How are SCBEMs, stem cell-based embryo models, different then?
SCBEMs are totally different. They aren't about making sperm and eggs. They are lab-grown structures that look like or mimic early embryos. But crucially, they're made entirely from stem cells. No sperm, no egg involved.
Sometimes called synthetic embryos or stembryos?
Exactly. And your source mentions they're being developed using human embryonic stem cells, citing work from places like the Weizmann Institute and Cambridge.
And these aren't just simple clumps of cells.
No, not at all. They're getting surprisingly complex. Your sources say they show classical post-gastrulation embryonic features. That's a key stage where specialized tissues and organs start forming.
Like what kind of features?
Things resembling early brain activity, a beating heart structure, foundations of other organs, even structures like the placenta and yolk sac have been observed in these models. It's quite remarkable.
Wow. But there's a limit. The source says they're only cultured for 14 days in the lab.
That's right, based on the International Ethical Guideline for Research on Actual Human Embryos. But the source points out it's kind of arbitrary and controversial to apply that rule strictly to SCBEMs, because unlike a natural embryo that starts at fertilization, there's no clear day zero for an SCBEM.
And they definitely can't develop into a baby.
Well, the sources are very clear. They cannot be considered true human embryos at this point. And they haven't produced live offspring to date. But the sources do add that this technical hurdle might very well be overcome in the near future. So it's a moving target. There are also safety concerns mentioned, like incomplete or irregular differentiation.
Okay, so let's nail the key distinction then. IVG makes the gametes, the sperm and egg, which then combine like in nature to make a genetically unique embryo.
Right.
Whereas SCBEMs are the embryo-like structures themselves, built directly from stem cells, skipping the gamete stage entirely.
Precisely. And that difference seems absolutely central to how Singapore is predicted to view them.
Okay, armed with that tech background, let's bring back that Singaporean lens. What are the core legal and cultural factors, according to your sources, that are going to shape how Singapore deals with this?
Your sources really zero in on a few key things. First, the existing laws. There's the Human Cloning and Other Prohibited Practices Act from 2004. That's a big one.
Okay.
Surrogacy is completely banned.
Right. And clinical RT services like standard IVF?
Those are restricted just to legally wedded heterosexual couples. That's the current rule.
So pretty clear legal framework. But the sources suggest the cultural side is just as important.
If not more so. They describe really strong societal support for traditional family formation through heterosexual marriage.
And this deep emphasis on genetics, genetic connection and familial ties.
Yes, which the sources link to primarily Confucian values. This idea of genetic affinity comes up repeatedly.
How does that play out?
Well, the sources cite legal rulings where judges have emphasized the fundamental human desire for a child sharing your genes, calling it part of the ordinary human experience for parents and children to be biologically linked.
So everything new gets filtered through that legal and cultural grid. The question is, how do IVG and SCBEMs stack up against those norms?
Okay, so based on that framework, the laws, the values, your sources make a pretty clear prediction about SCBEMs versus IVG in Singapore. What's the bottom line?
The prediction is pretty stark. SCBEMs are likely a no-go, probably banned outright, while IVG is likely to be permitted, but only in a very narrow, restricted way.
Why such a difference, according to the sources?
It boils down to that fundamental difference in the tech. SCBEMs, especially if made from one person's cells, are seen as genetically identical replicates.
Clones, basically.
Essentially, yes. And the source says they'd fall under that Human Cloning Act and be effectively banned.
And that obviously clashes with the genetic affinity value, too. Absolutely. Because in a heterosexual marriage, a child from a non-chimeric SCBEM would be genetically identical to only one parent. It breaks that expected two-parent biological link.
The source mentions maybe making chimeric SCBEMs using cells from both partners?
It does, but immediately flags significant health risks associated with that kind of mixing things like intersex conditions, autoimmune problems, even cancers. So that doesn't seem like a viable path either.
Okay, so SCBEMs hit roadblocks with cloning laws and the genetic identity principle. Why is IVG predicted to be more acceptable?
Because IVG, as the source puts it, replicates the natural process of meiosis and fertilization. It uses genetic material from two individuals, typically male and female in the context they're discussing, and creates a genetically unique offspring.
So it maintains that two-parent genetic connection to the child.
Exactly. It fits much more comfortably within Singapore's existing legal framework and those core family values about biological ties. It's seen as restoring a natural process, not replacing it wholesale.
Right, so IVG kind of works with the existing model, while SCBEMs seem to fundamentally challenge it. So if IVG is likely in, but only narrowly, what specific uses do your sources think will get the green light in Singapore? Always keeping those big constraints in mind, of course.
Right. The sources suggest there be minimal moral, ethical, or legal objections for applications that fix infertility within that framework of conventional heterosexual marriage. That's the absolute key constraint.
So like treating primary infertility, where couples just can't conceive for various biological reasons.
Exactly. Things like congenital issues, damage from chemotherapy, premature ovarian failure. IVG here is framed as a way to restore that natural ability to have biologically related children.
But there's a massive catch even there, isn't there? The surrogacy ban.
Huge catch. The source is very clear. IVG would likely only be allowed if the female partner has a functional womb and is medically fit to carry a pregnancy to full term.
So if she needs a surrogate for health reasons, even if they use IVG, that's still banned in Singapore.
Correct. That ban remains a major barrier.
What about technical issues, like if the infertility itself is caused by a genetic defect that IVG might pass on?
The source touches on maybe editing the stem cells first, but really emphasizes that the more practical and likely preferred route would be using PGT pre-implantation genetic testing.
To screen the embryos made after IVG.
Exactly. Screen them before implantation to avoid passing on known genetic issues linked to the infertility.
Okay, what about age-related female infertility? That seems like a huge potential application given Singapore's demographics.
Absolutely. With more women delaying childbirth, reduced ovarian reserves are a major issue. So IVG for older, married heterosexual couples seems likely to be permitted, aligning with that national goal of boosting birth rates.
Then again, the same caveat applies. It means a functional womb, medical fitness.
Right, the surrogacy ban still looms. The source also floats the idea that Singapore might impose an age cap on parents using IVG.
And it's not necessarily the first option.
Definitely not. The sources strongly argue that cheaper, simpler things like elective egg freezing or ovarian tissue freezing must always be encouraged first. IVG is positioned as a potential last resort for these cases.
The source also briefly mentions a potential social side effect. Women feeling more pressure maybe to delay starting families.
Yeah, it raises that possibility that the existence of IVG might subtly reinforce expectations for women to prioritize careers first, like the traditional male path, knowing this tech exists down the line. It's a subtle point, but interesting.
And what about transgender and intersex parenthood? How does IVG fit there?
Well, the source notes that in Singapore, transgender people can marry after completing sex reassignment, and intersex individuals assigned a legal gender can also marry. If they're in a legal marriage, they can access RT.
So IVG could potentially help if they can't produce their own gametes naturally.
It could, but again, that surrogacy ban becomes a major issue. For male-to-female transgender individuals, or intersex individuals assigned female at birth but lacking a functional womb, they would need a surrogate to carry the pregnancy. And since that's banned,
their path to using IVG within Singapore is blocked.
Precisely. It highlights how that ban really restricts the application, even if the core IVG tech itself might be theoretically possible.
Okay, one more potentially permitted application, preventing transmission of genetic diseases. This sounds like it overlaps with the gene editing.
It does, and it's a really interesting area. The source suggests IVG could actually make germline genome editing, using things like CRISPR to fix disease-causing genes in sperm, eggs, or embryos, potentially safer and more accurate.
Safer than editing an embryo directly. How?
The idea is you'd edit the stem cells first, the iPSCs. You can grow millions of these cells, test them extensively to make sure the edit worked correctly, check for any off-target effects, before you even start the process of turning them into sperm or eggs via IVG.
So much more quality control before making the gametes.
Exactly. Compared to editing a handful of cells in an early embryo, it offers potentially much greater precision and safety checking.
And the goal is clear: allowing people with known genetic disorders to have healthy children who are still biologically theirs.
Right. And the source argues this resonates with Singapore's values, that desire for genetic relatedness, the Confucian idea of lineage continuity.
But germline editing itself is hugely controversial globally.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The source acknowledges the debate, notes the urgency might feel lower than treating existing disease, but also points to potential long-term cost-effectiveness of prevention. Crucially, though, it stresses that PGT pre-implantation genetic testing is the cheaper, simpler, safer alternative that's already available and well-established.
So PGT is the first line of treatment.
And that's how the source puts it. Germline editing via IVG might only be considered justifiable in really specific rare cases.
Like when?
Like if PGT isn't an option for some reason. Or if the parents' genetics mean all their children would inevitably inherit the disease. Maybe both parents have 2 copies of a recessive gene, or one parent has 2 copies of a dominant one.
So very limited circumstances.
Very limited. And even then, the source emphasizes the global consensus. Germline editing shouldn't be used to start a pregnancy until its safety and accuracy are proven beyond doubt. Singapore would likely stick very closely to that international standard.
Okay, so that covers the narrow band of IVG uses likely to be allowed, mostly fixing infertility within traditional marriage, potentially preventing some genetic diseases, often with PGT preferred. Now let's flip to the applications your sources predict are firmly on the ban list in Singapore. Why are these seen as clashing too much?
Right. These are the ones predicted to run seriously afoul of Singapore's family law, healthcare regulations, and sociocultural values.
First up, posthumous reproduction, using cells from someone who has died.
Yeah, the idea of using IVG to create sperm or eggs from stored cells, maybe skin cells, bone marrow of someone deceased. The source notes this could be technically possible even for females or children, where retrieving eggs or sperm before death wasn't feasible.
But ethically and legally, very tricky. Why banned?
Multiple reasons cited. A huge one is the lack of written informed consent from the person who died. How do you get consent retrospectively?
It's impossible, really.
Pretty much. Then there's the surrogacy ban again. If the deceased was female or a male without a surviving wife capable of carrying the pregnancy, it wouldn't be possible within Singapore anyway.
And concerns about the child born.
Big concerns. The source raises questions about the rights, well-being, and psychology of children born this way. Growing up without that deceased parent, the potential burden on elderly grandparents as caregivers, it's fraught with issues.
Okay, next likely ban. Mass production of donor gametes. IVG could potentially make huge amounts of sperm or eggs from one donor.
This is where the tech scalability really raises red flags, according to the source. While it might be a big commercial market elsewhere, the prediction for Singapore is a ban due to major ethical worries.
Beyond the usual donor conception issues.
Way beyond. You've got the standard concerns, informed consent, the child's identity, right, to know their genetic background. But mass production amplifies risks dramatically.
Like what kind of risks?
The source points to the potential for commercializing desirable traits. Imagine ordering sperm from Nobel laureates or eggs from models. But the really acute risk, especially highlighted for a small, dense place like Singapore, is accidental incest.
Because there could be hundreds, maybe thousands, of half-siblings from a single popular donor.
Exactly. The risk of them meeting and forming relationships later in life without knowing they're related becomes significant. Singapore already limits donors to 5 live births. Mass IVG donation blows that wide open.
And using SCBEMs for donor embryos would be even worse?
The source says, even more contentious. Yes, because they'd be genetic copies. It does mention a potential niche exception for IVG eggs. Maybe for mitochondrial donation, where the main genetic inheritance isn't the issue.
What about genetic enhancement of offspring? Using these techs not to fix disease, but to improve kids.
Right, using germline editing via IVG, or maybe selecting embryos created via IVG based on polygenic scores to aim for non-medical traits, greater intelligence, athletic ability, certain physical features.
And the source connects this to Singapore's competitive culture, the focus on human capital. Even mentions this philosophical idea of procreative beneficence, that parents should choose the best child possible.
It acknowledges those pressures might exist. But despite that, the prediction is a firm ban. Why? Because there's a strong global consensus that employing germline genome editing or polygenic embryo screening for human enhancement is morally, ethically, and legally unacceptable.
And Singapore wants to stay aligned with international standards.
That seems to be the key factor, according to your source. Maintaining its reputation as a responsible biomedical hub means adhering to those global norms, regardless of any domestic pressures. Plus, public opinion worldwide is generally against enhancement.
Okay, now for a really big one, globally, same-sex parenthood, IVG technically opens possibilities here.
Technically, yes. It could potentially allow, say, eggs to be made from a man's cells or sperm from a woman's cells, meaning a same-sex couple could have a child genetically related to both partners. Chimeric SCBEMs are also mentioned, but again, with those health risk caveats.
But for clinical access within Singapore, the barrier is
The requirement for users of art services to be legally wedded heterosexual couples. Since Singapore doesn't recognize same-sex marriage in this context, domestic access is predicted to be blocked.
However, the source brings up a really crucial twist here. Couples going abroad for IVG.
This is where it gets fascinating. The source points to existing Singapore High Court rulings. And these rulings have strongly emphasized the primacy of genetic affinity and blood ties, and importantly, prioritizing child welfare above public policy.
So even if Singapore doesn't allow same-sex couples to use IVG domestically,
The legal precedents suggest that if a child is born abroad using IVG and is biologically related to one or both Singaporean parents in the same-sex relationship, the government will have to reluctantly and begrudgingly recognize that familial relationship.
based on those principles of genetic connection and the child's best interests.
That's the prediction from the source. They expect these children would likely be granted citizenship, residency, access to subsidies, inheritance rights, basically, acknowledged as family because of these powerful legal precedents, even though it contradicts the official policy on accessing RT domestically. It's a real point of tension.
What about solo parenthood? Using IVG to make both sperm and eggs from one person.
Predicted ban. The source says it directly contravenes official policy of encouraging traditional family formation via conventional heterosexual marriages.
And there are specific risks mentioned for this scenario, too.
Yes, for IVG used this way, the source flags severe medical risks from the extreme inbreeding involved. Making an embryo from your own sperm and eggs dramatically increases the odds of harmful recessive genetic diseases showing up.
And using an SCBEM from one person is just cloning again.
Right, which is already banned.
And finally, multiplex parenthood. More than 2 genetic parents.
Yeah, the source mentions the theoretical possibility of using IVG with stem cell lines, or maybe chimeric SCBEMs, to create a child with genetic contributions from 3 or more individuals, a kind of generational shortcut.
Sounds incredibly complex. Prediction.
Banned. Again, it doesn't fit the traditional family model. The source anticipates conservative social norms would view it as highly unnatural. Plus, the health risks with chimeric SCBEMs remain a concern.
Okay, so the predicted picture is pretty clear. IVG gets a cautious, limited green light for uses that align with the traditional family structure, while SCBEMs and anything challenging that structure or raising major global ethical flags are likely out. But your sources also include a kind of reality check section, don't they? Tempering expectations.
Yes, this caveat section is really important. It basically asks, okay, even if IVG is permitted for some, how much will it actually move the needle on Singapore's low birth rate?
And the answer seems to be not much.
Pretty modest, yeah. The source estimates IVG is unlikely to move total births by more than 10%, even on an optimistic view. They compare it to existing art rates elsewhere, like Australia, where maybe 1 in 18 births involves art, or Japan, around 1 in 11 or 12.
Why such a limited impact predicted?
Well, IVG is expected to have high costs, complexity, and labor intensiveness. It's not going to be a simple, cheap procedure, so it would likely only be used for the most intractable infertility cases.
A small fraction of the population.
Exactly. And then you layer on all those restrictive regulations we just talked about, the surrogacy ban, no single parents, no domestic same-sex access that further limits who's eligible, even for the permitted applications within Singapore.
Which leads straight into a cost-benefit discussion in the source. Is this massive investment worthwhile if it only helps a tiny group?
That's the question posed. The source suggests that the same amount of money put into, say, better childcare support or preschool subsidies might get more enthusiastic public support and help a significantly larger group of families.
And the cost per baby born via IVG looks really high compared to IVF.
Potentially 5 to 10 times higher per birth, according to the source's estimate, if it were subsidized.
So from a purely numbers-driven public health viewpoint, maybe hard to justify big subsidies, but from the individual patient perspective.
It's completely different, of course. The source acknowledges this tension, suggesting the government might end up permitting IVG for those who can afford it out of pocket, even if broad public subsidies aren't feasible.
And there's an economic angle for Singapore's biotech industry, too. Those restrictions impact the market size.
Definitely. If Singapore bans potentially large global markets like same-sex parenthood, mass donor gametes, maybe even enhancement down the line, the financial incentive for companies to develop and commercialize IVG in Singapore is reduced compared to countries with fewer restrictions.
So Singapore's whole approach here really becomes this complex case study, doesn't it? Trying to balance the potential economic and social benefits of these incredibly powerful technologies against the pertinent ethical issues and potential negative social repercussions.
And the source holds this up as a kind of lesson for other countries. It recommends governments really need to consider public opinion, think through the broad impacts on culture, politics, law.
Not just focus narrowly on the science or the commercial interests.
Exactly. Avoid that reductionist view.
And your source mentions Singapore has a specific body for this, the Bioethics Advisory Committee.
Yes. The BAC, which apparently engages in public consultation and dialogue, precisely to try and navigate these complex ethical frontiers.
So there we have it, a deep dive into this really complex intersection of cutting-edge tech, societal values, and law, all through the lens of Singapore based on the sources you sent us.
And that core tension is just so clear, isn't it? You have the incredible potential of IVG and SCBEMs overcoming infertility, maybe preventing disease, bumping right up against these deeply held beliefs about family, genetics, existing laws.
And Singapore's predicted path, based on this analysis, seems to be one of cautious, limited adoption, embracing IVG where it fits the traditional heterosexual marriage model, reinforcing genetic ties.
Right. While drawing quite firm lines against SCBEMs in applications like mass donation enhancement or domestic access for same-sex couples or single individuals that challenge those norms much more directly.
Yet, even as they draw those lines domestically, there's that fascinating prediction about the impact of globalization and existing legal principles.
Yeah, that the emphasis on genetic ties and child welfare in their own courts might mean they have to, perhaps reluctantly, recognize and accommodate children born via IVG abroad, even in family structures not officially sanctioned at home.
It really leaves us, and you listening, with a powerful thought, I think. As these reproductive technologies keep accelerating, keep pushing what's possible, how do societies decide where the boundaries lie? And what does that whole process, the debates, the decisions, the compromises tell us about what we truly value most when it comes to family, identity, and our vision of progress?